First of all, on behalf of UNDP, I really would like to extend my appreciation to the government of Morocco, and in particular, the Moroccan Correctional and Reintegration Department, which is one of UNDP's key partners, for the invitation to participate in this first African Forum of Prison and Reintegration Administration. I manage the African Regional Project on Prevention and Response to Violent Extremism in Africa. And in terms of my presentation, I'll structure it in terms of what are we doing as UNDP globally and zeroing in on the African continent. Related to the specific topic, I'm going to reflect more on the lessons that we have drawn from our experiences, and then some recommendations as well as sharing what we are doing taking this topic forward. As mentioned yesterday, by my colleague from CTED, we really look at a whole of society and whole of government approach in terms of addressing prevention and response to violent extremism. And this is clearly articulated in the Secretary General's Action Plan of 2015, which really calls for this comprehensive approach going beyond security-only responses to really look at what are the underlying drivers. The SG Plan of Action further acknowledges that harsh treatment in detention facilities can play a role in recruitment and radicalization of prisoners to violent extremist groups and terrorist organizations. It therefore calls for interventions to prevent the spread of violent extremism among prison communities while upholding protection and international human rights standards. Based on this action plan at the global level, UNDP developed the global framework Preventing Violent Extremism through Inclusive Development and the Promotion of Tolerance and Respect for Diversity. Furthermore, the organization has a unique role in terms of its support to delivery and integrated policy and programming efforts for the Sustainable Development Goals. And as we know, we have just entered the decade of action in terms of acceleration of achievement of these goals. And in terms of this topic, particularly focusing on SDG 16. From this position, we can draw on expertise from across UNDP signature solutions or thematic expertise, as well as 34 other UN entities that participate in the UNDP co-chaired Global Counterterrorism Compact PVE Working Group. On the African continent, we engaged in a highly consultative process with governments, regional organizations, academia, civil society, faith-based organizations, which led to the development of a project on preventing and responding to violent extremism in Africa, a development approach. It is co-led between the Arab states and Africa hubs, again, as mentioned earlier today, that it really does not respect borders, so really for the need for more of a coordinated approach. And the approach applies a development lens to complement security-focused responses. Towards this end, we work at multiple levels. Policy level, development of national strategies and action plans, capacity building of key institutions, and this would include prisons, community resilience broadly, and this is where also the rehabilitation, reintegration components, would fall in, looking at issues of alternative narratives, all of this very strongly infused with a gender lens, and definitely everything underpinned by evidence. So there is a very strong research component within the project. I will come back to this issue of research, but just to mention at this point that when we were in the process of developing the Africa Regional Project, one of the elements we found was that there was not enough available research on the issue of violent extremism on the continent, particularly from primary resources which were available and then used to inform interventions or programming. So this is really an area that we try to invest in very much. Currently, the project is operational in 21 countries across the continent, and in a number of these countries, a particular focus on peripheral or borderland areas. In the implementation of the project, as you can tell because of the breadth of it, we have very strong partnerships with the African Union, the Regional Economic Commissions, NGOs, civil societies, academia, religious organizations, and of course our other UN entities, CTED represented here today, the UN Office of Counterterrorism, and on the issue of prisons, in particular with UNODC. The project recognizes that state institutions such as prisons, which have become significant radicalization and recruitment locations, are a particular area of focus. The manner in which security agencies and law enforcement and military specifically respond to extremism is a critical component in the radicalization process and needs to be addressed. As mentioned earlier, a really strong foundation for this project is having an informed approach through research. And towards this end, in 2017, we released a study entitled The Journey to Extremism, where we interviewed about 714 individuals. Most of these interviews took place in prisons and rehabilitation centers, and then we had a control group and also interviewed their families to understand what is the journey of an individual from being radicalized towards violent extremism to joining the group, and where are the opportunities for engagement when we're looking at this preventative lens. From this research, we found that 71% of these respondents cited government action as the final trigger to their joining these groups, and this we call the tipping point. And this really emphasizes the importance of also building trust, the restoration of social contract, to prevent and respond to violent extremism. As such, one component of the project supports criminal justice systems to deal with radicalization and violent extremism. Just to highlight a few areas of support: training programs, development of strategies and action plans within institutions such as prisons, support to the development and implementation of protection schemes for personnel dealing with sensitive cases, gender-sensitive programs, and this is something which I'll come back to in terms of the lessons learned, trust building, which is really a key component in terms of this work, and the broad area of rehabilitation. So far, in terms of work with prisons, some of the countries we are currently supporting include Morocco, Kenya, and Tanzania, to name a few. So to go on to some of the key lessons which we have found so far. The first one is really the need for more Africa-focused research. In 2017, in preparation of a meeting convened by Penal Reform International, the UNDP Regional Hub in Amman, and UNODC, a literature review that was conducted that was found that most of the literature in existence came from Western contexts. It really is evidence of a major shortcoming in this area. And it is important, because of the context specificity, of this issue, to have context-specific research that can then inform the work around prevention and response to violent extremism. It's good to see that this is already beginning to change, but also where we have a lot of these rich lessons, while they might exist, they're not being transmitted or shared and therefore applied across different contexts. The second one is really context matters. To understand prevention of violent extremism in prisons, one must understand how violent extremism is defined in that particular context, its socio-political connotations, and consequently what form preventive efforts and the results of such work may take. As we know, we don't often have common definitions of what is violent extremism. What does prevention look like? How is it measured? So all of these elements really need to be unpacked within a particular context in order to have appropriate and context-specific approaches. The other element is how to identify radicalization taking place. So we know a lot of these indicators are very subtle. Radical worldviews should not necessarily be conflated with acts of violent extremism. Are these cognitive or behaviorally focused? And these are some of the elements, to look at. One of the elements mentioned is also, religious devotion. This is not necessarily an indicator. What are the particular subtle indicators that we must pay attention to in order to really identify where this is taking place, this radicalization towards violent extremism. And linked to this is the issue of false positive, cases where individuals who are not actually undergoing radicalization reported based on incorrect criteria. So again, really having very much of an informed approach. The other issue which has come up in the last 2 days is the issue of education. And I'd say more specifically, critical thinking skills. And this is one of the elements which has found to have long-term positive results, moving away from binary thinking and really trying to introduce more complex kind of thinking, which I see has been presented also in terms of the video today on issues of debate and discussion. But having these elements integrated not only in education programs within prisons, but if I can also broaden it, and a number of projects have been implemented in schools. Women's roles are multiple and complex. And this, really trying to acknowledge that women have a variety of roles within these violent extremist groups. One of the sort of feedback we hear in interviewing some of these women, particularly in rehabilitation centers, is them having had sort of positions of power and influence within a violent extremist group, but in terms of the activities they're undertaking in some of these rehabilitation centers, which are quite gendered specific kind of activities, feeling quite frustrated in this role. So again, really trying to match the kind of sort of position of the person and the role they've had with something meaningful and which they can feel, fulfilled. A key issue also with women is in terms of rehabilitation. And what we find is the experiences of men and women vary greatly in terms of reintegration into the communities. In particular areas in the continent, I can say, is that it is harder for women to reintegrate back into the communities from which they came from than men do, and particularly when they return with children. And so this is an issue of stigma and also, needs to be, unpacked of how to address this issue. Designing reintegration efforts with a lens on beneficiary strengths and resilience in mind contributes to prevention. And this again, helps them to participate more authentically and reintegrate into the communities more sustainably. Strong representation of the specific needs groups, I'd say in rehabilitation, as I mentioned earlier, we really focus on the issue of strong partnerships, and the other element is working with organizations or entities at the local level that have the trust of the community and involving them within the rehabilitation process. So we did have a reflection and consultation with civil society organizations who are part of reintegration and what kind of role can they play, and again the complement of state and non-state actors within this area. The other element is what I can broadly refer to as conflict-sensitive approaches to rehabilitation and reintegration. What we find is highlighting a particular at-risk group or a group where it's deemed to be seen to be rewarded for having engaged in these kinds of activities. And we have seen examples where individuals reintegrating back into the community have been targeted, or whereby people state they have been part of this group in order to get the benefits. So really looking at how to not highlight this particular group, how to integrate them, in a way that is conflict sensitive. The next element, looking at broadly community resilience, is citizens' awareness, and the understanding of their role is critical to the success of addressing radicalization and violent extremism at community level. So really engagement with a cross-section of communities, women, youth, religious leaders, and also the understanding of what is violent extremism within their context so that they're better able to identify it. The next one relates to that, which is the issue of right messaging is critical in communicating against radicalization and violent extremism. The appropriateness of messaging or alternative narratives used in PVE is critical for communities' buy-in, as well as trying to engage with individuals who have been radicalized. And this is important not only for institutions, but also communities engaged in these areas.
S'il vous plaît,
Oui?
2 minutes.
ça
Merci
va.
beaucoup.
And the last element which I want to highlight is really the implementation of effective monitoring and evaluation systems. Some of the programs that we have been supporting have received midterm evaluations, and one of the key recommendations coming out is really the need for ongoing follow-up in measuring and also looking at issues of behavioral change, attitudes, issues of trust, and really having that kind of follow-up to really measure whether this person has been completely rehabilitated and has been able to reintegrate back into the society. So in terms of the way forward, and this is a mix of recommendations and also highlighting what we are focusing on, is starting with the last point, really being able to strengthen M&E following rehabilitation and reintegration. In order to really show impact, we need to understand and know what we are measuring. And towards this end, on our part, we're trying to look at strengthening indicators. Our Amman Hub did a lot of work in terms of trying to unpack some of these subtle indicators. And also we've been developing tools to adequately measure issues of trust. The importance of Africa-focused research. We are planning to develop an Africa Knowledge Hub, which can be a center for information. Strengthening the gender dimensions of work. More and more we're seeing these challenges, particularly on women. Strengthening the community of practice on PVE on the continent, as well as continuing to support South-South cooperation. And we see already there have been requests from Cameroon to learn from the Morocco experience. In terms of the primary research, following up on the research study which I mentioned, The Journey to Extremism, where we interview individuals who are part of these groups, because this is the best source of information where we can understand what do we need to do in terms of the rehabilitation, how do we address these underlying drivers. And just to mention, some of the findings we found from the first research that was released in 2017, which helps to inform interventions, is that although more than half cite religious ideology, more than 53% of these individuals had little to no understanding of the religious texts that they cite. We're looking at economic drivers. The majority of those cited frustration with their economic situation, and this is what pushed them to join. The issues of limited education. So this all helps to inform what we need to focus on. On our part also, we're looking at more targeting the community. So when we're looking at conflict-sensitive approaches, moving away from the individual and trying to transform the communities in which they live. So for example, when we're looking at economic opportunities, we have partnered with the Tony Elemulu Foundation to provide 100,000 entrepreneurs in the Sahel with opportunities. So in conclusion, I can say that interventions on PVE in prisons cannot be introduced in isolation. As I've explained from our approach, it's really looking at quite a holistic approach, looking at from the prevention and also the rehabilitation and reintegration. Secondly, as a last conclusion, I'd also say is that while when we started this work, we looked at very specific PVE interventions, but what we have learned from the work is the need to really mainstream a PVE lens across issues of prison reform. And in this way, we can really have an impact on addressing this issue. Thank you very much.